Why are you looking so serious?
I don't know.
You having one of those kind of mornings?
No, I just been up reading.
What you been? Okay, nope, not gonna do it. Not gonna do it. Messed up last time. Last time we were supposed to have a whole different kind of conversation. We were supposed to talk about Aristotle. We had said we was gonna do that, and I opened up and a can of worms I didn't mean to open up. It was a good show, but you had prepared a whole meal that we didn't even get a chance to taste because we went on a detour down a book that you were reading, and I don't even want to talk about it. And so I'm not even going to ask you what you were reading today. Would it have anything to do with the topic that you wanted to talk about today or last week?
Did you say unless it did?
Yes.
I was reading Plato,
Oh, well, in
reading
that
the
case,
Phaedrus.
I don't know what that is, but okay. What's the Phaedrus?
The Phaedrus is one of Plato's dialogues. So most of what Plato wrote is in dialogue form, where it's one or two characters talking with Socrates, sometimes a small crowd of characters talking with Socrates about some philosophical topic. So the Phaedrus is them, they're talking about whether love is or is not a kind of insanity, whether love is a loss of reason, meaning it's a full-on insanity. So Phaedrus says you've got to avoid love because love makes you crazy and you stop acting reasonable. If you're in love, you do things that don't make reasonable sense anymore, and so you've got to avoid it.
Okay, you know where I see that playing a part right now? Have you seen the whole manosphere? The whole manosphere is a large portion of the guys who are leading kind of the manosphere. I think the manosphere is kind of dead now. It's morphed into something else. But those guys are saying, don't get married.
Right.
Don't do it. It makes you weak to be married. And it's almost because you become insane because you fall in love. And love makes you do stuff that is not reasonable. And as a man, you need to be reasonable.
You stop caring only about yourself and doing the things that benefit you, and you start caring about benefiting others. And that's a kind of insanity.
What sacrament do you have to be eating of in order to believe that about the world?
Well, it's the real politic. It's the same sort of mindset that says this world is a harsh, difficult place, and you've got to be out for you because nobody else is, and so do what you need to, because there's either there's no judgment coming after death, and so all you can get is what you can get now, or there's the place is it's just a place built of coercion, and so either you're coercing or you're being coerced.
Right.
There's and so love makes you weak because you're fighting for somebody besides yourself, and you'll end up coerced.
I interrupted you. So you were reading about whether or not love is worth actually getting because it makes you insane if you get it and you don't become reasonable. So
yes, you become unreasonable because love puts something besides yourself at the center, and what's interesting.
Does it though?
Well, what's interesting is even Socrates, the way he interacts with it is he says, well, okay, let's accept your definitions. He says, but then what's wrong with insanity? He doesn't actually go the way you would expect in the and there's a number of phrases taken out of this.
I'm just thinking about, you ever see Eddie Murphy's Brooklyn, Vampire Brooklyn?
Yeah.
If loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That's where he goes with it, basically.
But he ends up, the direction that he takes the dialogue is, well, but what if loving God is is a kind of insanity, is a kind of, but it's a divine insanity because God is so beautiful. Wouldn't that be actually good? And so then he goes into a whole thing about how God is the great unmoved mover that lives beyond the heaven of heavens and is pure beauty, pure justice, and that loving that actually is going to is actually going to make you better. But it is a kind of insanity because you have to quit seeing by sight and start seeing beyond what your eyes can see. Because if you just interact according to what your eyes can see, it makes total sense to only fight for yourself. But if you look above and beyond the created order to what he calls he is who he is, then you learn that the insanity that of that actually makes you into the kind of creature you were intended to be. It's really, so this is the reason that different Christians said, well, wait a second, Plato he's so close. He's so close to the truth. And then but then he goes off into different tangents at different times, and you go, oh no, he's not right. He doesn't have the truth, but he gets really close because he calls this world a seeing in a glass darkly. But you have to look beyond what your eyes can see in order to raise your soul to be because the deepest desire of your soul is to experience the beauty of God who lives beyond the heavens. He's really, really close. And there are times when he talks about that we need an unbegotten God, that a begotten God is he can't actually give us what we need, because a begotten God would be dependent upon something unbegotten. And so we need this unbegotten God. He is who he is, who lives beyond the heavens, who is pure spirit. A number of things that the Bible uses to talk about who God is. And then he says, but there's no way that in one lifetime you could ever achieve that on your own merit. So there must be some sort of multiple life solution where we, reincarnation, because there's no way any human could achieve what he needs in one lifetime, which is true, right? He's even got the problem right. He just doesn't have access to the revelation of God. And so he says, it must be some sort of reincarnation. If we're ever going to get there, it must be some sort of reincarnation.
That's what groping in darkness looks like, right? Like, right. It just has to be. I just know that there is. The word of God is laying right there. It's like,
and because he makes an argument from the beauty that you find in the world and the way that our soul involuntarily responds to it. Mm-hmm. Our soul involuntarily responds to it and wants to climb up it to something beyond it. That's what our soul does. So, but knowing humanity, knowing people, there's no way that, in this life, every life you've got to work off the errors that you've made. And so you must need multiple lives. And even that, he's right about that. You do need multiple lives. It's just that the second life isn't your life to get there, right? The second life is the life of Christ. So the Phaedrus it's an incredible book. And that Leonidas says he reading Plato's dialogues, he says he's possessed by the same genius of Homer, and meaning like they believed that Homer was divinely inspired, right? That there was a genius that divinely inspired the poetry of Homer to give him a glimpse of the reality beyond, and that same genie came back and guided Plato to give this divine inspiration.
That is not what I mean when I say somebody's a genius. I
I
do
know.
not think Elon Musk has a little demon on his shoulder giving him information.
But that is the way that they because the limitations of sinful man are such that without divine help, we can't get out of ourselves. That's the way they understood it. Which Christians believe that too. We just actually believe that God personally, by means of the Holy Spirit, is the genie behind it all.
Which one does Christians fall into? Do they fall into a Platonic or an Aristotelian type of?
Well, at different times they've emphasized different philosophers
depending on what's going on.
Because Aristotle was so Plato was Socrates' student. And Plato, when Socrates died, Plato begins writing down what he remembers about Socrates' conversations. And then he begins writing his own works using Socrates as a character in dialogues. And he starts a school. And
he's the Greg Bonson. He's the Greg Bonson of Van Til.
Of Van Til, yeah, exactly. And then and then Aristotle is his student and is studying with him. And then he, after I believe it was about 30 years of studying with Plato, being his premier student, then he goes out and he starts his school. Aristotle ends up the personal tutor of Alexander the Great when he's a young man. And so Aristotle basically tutors the emperor, who the man who creates the empire, and then
to Alexander the Great.
To Alexander the Great, and then Aristotle dies the year after Alexander the Great. Alexander Great in the 11-12 years that he was emperor completely transformed the world. He was an incredible personality, incredible person. And
he studied underneath Aristotle.
So Aristotle was his tutor as a child. So many of the good things that Alexander the Great did and established were because of Aristotle's tutelage. Well, and then the Hellenistic, the Greek Empire, is subsumed by the Roman Empire. So Rome begins to grow in strength, and then takes over the Greek Empire. But the language of the language of philosophy, or the language of education, stays Greek. Latin is the language of the court system, but Greek is the language of the really of the educated class.
Why is that?
Well, they're not as far apart as it's a little like when you had French and English both coinciding in the
Louisiana. You got that kind of going on down there.
Yeah, you've got sort of two languages that are close enough that you can learn and know both, or German and English. They're close enough that you can learn and know both, and they're related. And a lot of the words have just become Latinized. You are just sort of added to the Latin dictionary. And then the church, Jesus shows up in that linguistic situation. He is, speaking Aramaic, which is really close to Hebrew, is sort of it's sort of street Hebrew. I don't know. Hebrew to Aramaic is sort of like Middle English to English, or maybe High Elizabethan English to modern English. Right? So you've got they're very closely related, and so somebody speaking Aramaic could walk into the synagogue and understand the scriptures as they're read out, understand the law. Yeah. So that situation is where Paul gets his education. So he would have gone to Hebrew school. He definitely knew Greek. He pulls in the phraseology of Aristotle at times, the phraseology of Plato, not necessarily because he's relying on Plato and Aristotle, but because the phrasing of thought, the shape of thought in Greek had become so, the shape of thought in Paul's day had been formed by Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Hesiod. Those authors have given the way the world thought its shape through their language. So Paul really pulls in, and John, pulls in different thought forms, just because they're writing in Greek, and Greek is full of those thought forms. There's no way around it. And sometimes they
kind of like Christianity is with English. Would you say the same thing?
Right. Yeah. So there's no way, if you're talking in English to people, you have to use English, and English brings with it a certain imaginative landscape that was developed by the poets and the authors and
that's true of all language, right?
Yeah, that's just the way language works. So when you reading Plato, you see a lot of the thought forms of Paul, because Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, just by force of personality and excellent writing. Well, Aristotle is not a great writer the way Plato was. Plato is an amazing writer. Aristotle was a very clear systematizer and thinker, and so he systematized Plato's thought and then disagreed with it at times and in places, and so you end up with these Platonic and Aristotelian thought forms that just are a part of the New Testament. And that's part of what I think it means when it says the fullness of times had come upon them. You have the Roman Empire with the greatest pagan law system that the world had ever seen. It had taken what was great about Athens, the Athenian law system, and then spread it broadly, and made it multicultural in the good sense of the word. It pulled a law system
it together. Made all cultures one.
Well, it made it so that that people in different places could share a law system. So Athens had some incredible legal minds, but it really only worked in Athens. You couldn't export it because it was dependent upon knowing your neighbor in a very particular way. The Roman legal theorists broadened it such that they pulled the principles out and made it accessible in different places. So you have this incredible Roman legal system, Roman law, Roman roads, Roman accessibility to the world. That
shout out to the Fukushans.
Right. And then you had the thought forms of Greek that were in some ways, it's the first time that you have really a heathen system that can be invaded with Hebrew thinking, because it's broad and accessible enough. So the New Testament is written in this situation, in this scenario that is called the fullness of times, and part of that is the language was prepared for the New Testament to be written in. And then the early church, it used Greek and Latin in order to develop the theological distinctions that it needed to be made for the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the definition of Chalcedon. All of those were, you needed the thought forms of Plato and Aristotle, not the theology of Plato and Aristotle, but the linguistic thought forms were developed by them. So it really was the fullness of times, for all of those reasons.
So then you get, so can you give me through time frames here? So you got Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great, right?
Yeah.
So what time frame are we looking at?
So Socrates and Plato, you're looking at the 400s, and then Aristotle he brings it up to Alexander the Great, who is the high 300s, I believe.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
That's okay. I want to get him exactly right. And they so Plato makes it actually into the 300s.
Okay.
And then Aristotle is 384 to 322. And that is also the era where, so you go from Athens being an important town with a group of city-states that kind of join together for self-defense, and Athens is basically the leader. You have the Peloponnesian War ends Athens' supremacy, but it's military supremacy. But the Peloponnesian War also disillusioned a lot of people. So Socrates, he's called the gadfly of Athens because he goes around saying, "Prove to me we're the good guys. Are we really the good guys in this? Are you sure we're the good guys in this war?" And you have the Euripides. You've got playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And by the time you get to, in Aeschylus, Athens is still the hero. By the time you get to the third generation of poets, they're starting to say, well, what if we're not always as heroic, right? So you get, and the empire is born just as people are starting to doubt whether Athens is actually always the good guy in the wars.
Are you trying to make the parallel of America over the last century?
There's no good way to miss it, right?
Was that intentional, or are you just telling the story?
This is just the story. This is how it works. Man. So the empire spreads, and they say, well, it's good for the world to get what we've got in Athens to the rest of the world. And so the empire spreads, but as it begins to spread, begin getting these voices, literary voices saying, are we confident we're always the good guys? Right? Is this what's really interesting is you also start to get transsexuals and homosexuality growing right at the same time that the empires, they start to doubt that the empire is a good idea, right? The empire is stretched beyond its
wait. No,
capacity.
You can't go past this. How and why? Where did it come from? Work that out.
So this is something I've been wrestling with for about a decade, because you see the same thing in the fall of the Roman Empire. You suddenly start getting men dressing like women, the crazy sexual perversion. As the empire falls, people start to as the empire reaches its peak, people start to act like they have, that the empire gives them power over reality. And so you start to get this idea that spreads that a guy putting on a dress can be a girl, that homosexuality is not just acceptable, but is the best form of sexuality.
We're not talking about 21st century right now. We're talking about,
no, we're talking about the 300s in Greece. We're talking about the 100s in Rome, the 100s and the 200s in Rome, the Roman Empire, as it spreads and starts to the moral fabric starts to degrade underneath the weight of the empire. The same things happens when the British Empire reaches its peak. You suddenly get homosexuality and transsexuals just walking through the halls of power. So, and then the American Empire, obviously that's what's happening right now. We've overstretched our ability to be confident, overstretched our ability to rule well, but then also overstretched our ability to be confident in our own moral superiority.
So, Jason, does it? Oh, so many questions. I don't even know where to start. Let me start here. Was it a breakdown in family first that began to happen? Was it a breakdown in piety and what were the things that led up to? Because it seems like from the way you just stated it, it seems like that success and wealth brought with it a breakdown of culture.
I think it's the transferring of the responsibilities to the state that seems to do it. There's responsibilities of the family to the state.
Interesting. So
it seems to end up having this effect. This is the way human beings respond.
You know what? Hold on, man. That just made sense. So as you go back, you look at Black America in early turn of the century, you had the intact Black family, even through all of slavery and through all the mess going on, because that hadn't switched yet.
Right.
The responsibility and duties of the state hadn't switched yet. After Reconstruction, move on to the 20s and the 30s, you start seeing a change of responsibilities and duties switching from individuals in a particular state, even with all the failures of our country. By the time you get to the 60s, 20 years later from the 40s, you start realizing, oh my goodness, the Black family is about to fall apart, because there's so much that has switched responsibility-wise for a particular class to the state from the family. And by the time you get there, the Moynihan report is saying this is not looking good at all.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. As you're saying that, I'm seeing, oh yeah, that makes way more. That actually is a good connector, because why would a minority group in America lose so much in such a short amount of time? And the only thing you can notice is that switch that went from personal responsibility, right, to government responsibility. The individual's responsibility, prophet, priest, and king duties are transferred over to the state.
You have the same sort of thing when everybody comes back. Well, when World War I happens and you have a huge loss of life of fathers, the state steps in and starts taking over the role of the fathers really around that time. And it just grows in its capacity, but it begins, in the 30s to, and there's a reason too that when the USSR was looking for communist spies, they would go to the gay clubs. They would go, and uh, because there's not a connection to they don't have the familial connections.
Yeah.
Right.
There's no piety there, right? Responsibility
Right.
and duty to a place where, none of that's there.
So, and Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid in Rome, about the Roman establishment of the Roman Empire, Aeneas leaving Sparta at the fall, or leaving Troy at the fall of Troy, and going to establish Rome. That it's all about piety, and his piety to his father and to his family is what sets Aeneas apart. That is something that was needing to be reinforced. Hey, don't forget, but in an interesting historical turn of events, what happens is that piety begins being applied to the state, right? So the loyalty to father is shifted into loyalty to empire.
So then explain real quick when we talk about piety, what do we mean?
Keeping your vows, and usually piety begins by the vows that you are born into. So you're born into a familial set of responsibilities. So you don't stand up and take those vows. Those are vows that are taken by your birth into a family.
Sorry, I just left that on there. I just throw that out there. You don't have to respond to that. That's on me. Y'all can send me those emails at jasonfarley@gmail.com. Go ahead. I'm just poking. I
know you are. You always are. You're the gadfly. But you have this. So piety, a pious person is someone who fulfills their vows even to their own hurt. In
vows that we're born into.
Right? Vows that you're born into is where you begin, and then because you're good at keeping those vows, you become a pious person who will keep any vows and can be trusted. Right. So, so you've got that. That understanding is central to a Roman understanding of what's good and what's good and what's right. So that's the century before Jesus is born, right? Is you've got this Roman imperial piety being seen as important by everyone. By the time you get to 100 AD, the Roman Empire is starting to look around, and instead of saying we really need the piety of the citizen as the foundation, you start getting the foundation is you start getting the rivalry as the foundation of the Roman Empire really setting in. And so that's why you get Christian martyrs and such, is they start looking around and saying, this place isn't working like it should. Who can we blame? Well, Virgil says, well, look at the citizens. Are they good people? That's what we need to have a good state, to have a good civic society, is good people that keep their vows, people that are pious, people that do what they're supposed to do, produce a good state. And they start saying, well, we know it's not our fault, so whose fault is it? And so a lot of the waves of persecution of Christians are a way of restoring order to people that no longer believe in the empire.
So is this, when you looking at that moment, was it evident that multiculturalism was destroying the society? Because that's part of what they have going on there too. Their identity is completely being lost, but it's being lost because the Roman Empire again has brought in so many people into its empire that the identity of what that empire isn't there anymore.
Well, I think what it is you don't have the same sort of integration going on where people are integrated into a Roman law, right? As they spread, instead of making the world safe for democracy as the charge, it was we're going to bring the world into the peace of Rome, right? We're going to Aeschylus in Athens in the golden age of Greece in the 5th century BC, he writes about how you at times have different sets of duties that are set off against one another. But the duty to family and the duty to the civic realm are some of those duties that sometimes come into conflict.
Kind of like Joe Biden and Hunter Biden.
Right. Yeah. What do you do when you've got a duty to your country and a duty to your family and they're in conflict? How do you make that decision? Well, Aeschylus and in Athens, what they come up with is the jury system, a jury of your peers, as a way of spreading out the duty of justice so that families don't have to be responsible for revenge, right? When families are responsible for revenge, and cousin Joe gets killed by
Blood Avenger,
Bob, then the Blood Avenger has to go take care of him, but then now Bob's cousin is going to come after you, and right, you get the cycle of the Blood Avenger. Well, the jury spreads out the responsibility for vengeance to the whole city. You've got jurors that represent the whole city, and you can't kill the whole city. So that really establishes peace in the ability for tribalism to be sort of de-centered, to make it possible for different tribes to be at peace with one another, right? Because there's a way for tribes to get justice when they commit crimes against one another. This is
why partiality has to be a must inside of justice, because otherwise it looks like tribalism, which means we're all at war with anybody and nobody's going to get justice. That's
right.
That's
exactly.
Helpful.
So an impartial jury acting on behalf of the city, or acting on behalf of the whole civilization,
according to a contract that we've all agreed to, the judicial system. Right.
Yeah, a contract that a covenant that we're born into, right?
Yes,
we're born into this covenant, and that makes it possible for different tribes to be at peace with one another. Well, the Roman Empire takes that and spreads it beyond just the life of the city, but brings the peace of Rome, which makes it possible for different tribes to integrate into a peaceful coexistence, and that is that's the story that they tell as they spread the empire, right? And they make it, they build in a really big empire that way. When it similar to when the British Empire learned about what was really going on in the Congo, right? Where they realize, oh, we're the bad guys in the Congo, right? Joseph Conrad writes the novel Heart of Darkness and opens up the reality that the British Empire is not a blessing in the Congo, because you've got bad men running the colony. So that the bureaucracy didn't do its job of making sure that people that were conquered are integrated into the empire well. That it's not enough to have the right law system, because bad people, even with a good law system, bad people still do bad things.
You have to have inculcation of the heart, obviously.
Right. And so you have a similar sort of thing going on as the Roman Empire reaches beyond its capacity to govern. You can't actually govern that distance well. So, but until it reaches that point, they're spreading the peace of Rome. They're bringing goods and services and justice and all sorts of things. And so people are integrating into the empire, sometimes voluntarily. Sometimes they're, you've got people that say, no, it's actually good for us to be a part of the Roman Empire. And this is the Sadducees. That's what the Sadducees are saying. It's good for us to be a part of the Roman Empire. This is a blessing to us. It's a good thing. And then you've got the nationalists, the nationalists, which are, some of the Pharisees, the Pharisees and the Zealots or the Sicarii, they are the nationalists saying, no, it's not good for us to be a part of the Roman Empire. And then you have everything from the people that want to overthrow the Roman Empire and believe that God is going to bless them when they stand up and throw them out. And then you've all the way to the Pharisees that say, if we just obey God, he will remove the Roman Empire. If we can be pure, if we can follow the law, God will remove the Roman Empire.
But enough about today.
Right. Things, people are people no matter what age. That's the reality. So what we're going through is what happens when empires overreach their ability to govern. Right? So often two things happen at once. So we're so focused on governing the world that we forget to take care of the people at home, and voices that come in explaining that we're not the good guy anymore spread. And so you've got rot from the inside, and then you also overreach and you can't actually govern at the distances that we're trying to govern at. And people groups respond in the same sort of way because they're responding from a human nature that is set, right? We can't actually change human nature. And so humans, the mannishness of man, we talked about last time, Udo Middleman, that was who wrote on the mannishness of man. He was studied under Francis Schaeffer. It's a brilliant short book or long essay somewhere in there called The Mannishness of Man. So no matter what happened, no matter where you are and when you are, people respond a certain way to empires overstretching their bounds. So birth rates go down, the homosexuality and transsexuality starts to go up. The other thing that starts to show up is bestiality, which
wow. Udo
Middleman. UDO.
If my wife sees this book show up, I'm in trouble. It's just a little book. Is it a PDF somewhere? Or is it,
I either photocopied or got a PDF of it somehow back in the early days of the internet.
I don't want to. I think I just found it. The Middleman. Oh no, it's not it.
Udo Middleman. He wrote a brilliant book on modern art. But modern art is another, I think, symptom of the disease of an overstretched empire. So because we believe that we as a human race have achieved power over reality. And so we start being able to say, I'll tell you what's beautiful. Beauty is no longer an objective thing. I'll tell you what's beautiful. This is beautiful, and here's why, right? It's sort of a Gnostic argument for beauty, rather than that, like what Plato talks about, where when we see real beauty, our soul responds to it in a our soul responds to it. It doesn't act of its own accord and decide, oh, that's beautiful, I'm going to respond. Our soul just responds to it. So that, so you've got in Athens, you've got people start to no longer believe in the moral superiority of the Greeks. And then you have Plato come along and say, well, then let's talk about what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to be a good human? Let's delve into this. And then Aristotle systematizing Plato, Socrates, and then adding to it, systematizing knowledge. And they can do that because there is peace and wealth, right? That the empire really did bring, right? The peace and the wealth of the empire makes it possible to have the philosophical space and time to work through those things.
Kind of like socialism has capitalism.
Right.
We can feed off of this for a little bit.
But it ultimately ends up kind of undermining the more, not, it doesn't undermine necessarily the moral strength. It identifies that the moral strength of the people has been undermined. And so they're less and less pious, less and less virtuous. And the discussions of what is virtue don't happen when people are being virtuous. It happens when people start being less virtuous. Then they start to say, okay, we've got to talk about what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean, right? When everybody is bought in and they're being good citizens, you don't have the discussions about it. But that's what happens as the empire spreads to its limit. You start saying, wait a second, and what's amazing, Eumenides, I think Eumenides writes a play about the women all having a sex strike because they start to say, we can control the men with a sex strike and get them to stop going out there and fighting. So when Trump was elected and the sex strike was declared, I was like, oh, I know where we are in this story. This is right at the end of the empire. This is what happens.
Do you think that, I've always thought about this. Okay. No, I'm not gonna get there. Let's keep going. I'm gonna keep going through this and get to Aristotle and how much his influence of thought is in ours and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Because I can get lost in the narrative that is like right. I mean, this just overlays perfectly.
Yeah, it really does. So in a lot of ways, Vietnam was our Peloponnesian War, where we go to war and then we start to say, wait, are we the good guys or not? Mm-hmm. And then we lose. And some people back home even say, whew, glad we lost that one. And then you get this degradation of confidence in the empire, followed by an incredibly strong hand coming in to bring order, which was that was the Ronald Reagan moment of, we just need a really strong hand that's going to bring some order to this. I think I've changed I've been in the middle of changing my take on Nixon for a few years. Yeah, so I haven't set, I didn't know much about him other than, what you learn in cartoons growing up.
I am not a crook.
I am not a crook. Right.
He was right.
And he wasn't. That's the truth. So in Joseph McCarthy, you realize when the moment you realize Senator McCarthy was the good guy and he actually saved America, that is a huge moment when you start to say, oh, wait a second. But that's a digression. This is all just one big digression, though. So
it is. That's okay. That's our conversations are always like that. There's nothing new. Anybody's listening who knows that.
So what ends up happening in Christianity is Augustine, Origin, Augustine, you've got some different people that are coming out of Platonism into Christianity, and they bring some of the more specific thought forms of Plato with them into actually what I would put it this way is Plato asks questions that the Bible doesn't ask, but Origin and Augustine in the East and in the West, they answer Plato's questions with the Bible, but bringing the questions in has an effect on some things, and Augustine is sort of saved directly out of Neoplatonism, and so he says, well, the Bible actually answered the questions I had better. As he gets older, he gets more focused on, well, but what questions does the Bible ask, and how do we answer those? So they sort of bring Plato and some Aristotle into the theological conversation broadly. It's always been there a little bit, but they bring it in really broadly.
Can you give me an example of that? Like what
so the question, how do we know what we know? Epistemology, or well, let's do the question of how is a thing what it is.
Yeah.
How do so the question of Plato answers it with the forms, where he says an individual thing partakes in the form, in the eternal form of a thing, and so it is what it is because of its relationship to the eternal form of that thing. So a horse is a horse because it partakes in the eternal form of horseness.
It's
metaphysical. It's ontology.
It's ontology.
Right?
Sorry,
it's ontology. Yeah. So, and then from its ontology, it gains its telos, what it's for, how it's supposed to be used, what the proper end of a thing is. And so the form gives it its ontology, its nature, and the nature gives it its telos. Augustine says, okay, well, if that's the question, how does a thing become, why is a thing what it is? The form is the thoughts of God, right? That's the eternal form, is the thoughts of God. So what God believes a thing is, or says a thing is, or thinks that a thing is, those are all analogies, but that is, it partakes ontologically in its form because of God's thoughts, right? And then we should listen to what God says a thing is for, because his thoughts are informing what a thing is, and so its telos then grows out of what God says a thing is and what it's for. That is a Platonic shaped answer using biblical categories. So, which doesn't mean it's right or wrong, or that we haven't argued whether it's right or wrong at that point. We're just that Plato came out of the Neoplatonic movement with that belief system, and he said, well, there isn't.
You mean Augustine came out of the Neoplatonic?
Oh yeah, sorry. Augustine came out of a Platonic belief system that was asking that question and had a particular shape to the answer, and he took the content out and said, well, no, it's not an impersonal form up here. It's a personal form that is dependent upon God for its existence. God is the one that gives things their shape, and he does so by his thoughts. That ends up affecting the way Western Christianity develops its understanding of how to know what a thing is and what it's for, and in positive ways. Boethius in his Consolation of Philosophy and in his De Trinitas, his On the Trinity, he brings Plato and Aristotle's thought process into questions of sovereignty, questions of providence, and then vocabulary of the Trinity. Augustine brings in vocabulary of the Trinity from Plato and Aristotle as well, in order to say, here is what the Trinity is, and here is what it's not. Here is a false way for people speaking Latin to describe the Trinity, and here's a true way for people speaking Latin to describe the Trinity. And they use Plato and Aristotle's vocabulary because it's the vocabulary of an educated person. It's the vocabulary of precision in their day. But they both knew that you get the definitions of those words from Plato and Aristotle. So those are some examples of why they continue to be important.
Who's the vocabulary of precision in our day?
Well, most of our vocabulary of precision comes from the Enlightenment, which is less philosophical and more I mean, it's more of a science-based, like when we want to talk precision, we start using scientific language.
So then it would be what's the so it'd be scientific vocabulary is now
yeah.
So then does that change? So then that changes how we can observe even certain things, because that means we lose a metaphysic. If it's scientific, we can only tell what it does, not what it's for.
Right.
What it
so
is.
we work backwards from. So a good example of this is when you start talking about the creation of the world, right? When you start talking about Genesis 1, and people start asking science questions of the poem, and it's not that you can't ask those questions, but those aren't necessarily the questions that Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are trying to answer. But so it's a wineskin that you're filling, and it's going to burst at some point. So you can, it's a historical poem. I think that's probably the best way that's the genre that you would put the early parts of Genesis in. It's a historical poem, and you read historical poetry in a particular way, and you do science in a different sort of way. And so asking scientific questions of a historical poem, you can get some answers, but you're not going to get all the answers that you want, all the scientific answers that you want.
So then can I even ask a scientific question about the creation then?
I mean, you can't, so without an eyewitness, you can ask scientific questions, but you're not going to be able to get scientific answers. You're getting historical answers to scientific questions, which we do all the time. I mean, that is something that you can do, but there's a limitation to scientific inquiry anytime you're looking at the past, because you can't do experiments. You can't. Science is a forward-facing discipline.
As you're thinking about it, I'm thinking about, let's say that the second day, or no, let's get to the sixth day, or after the first Sabbath rest, the eighth day. I like that even better. The eighth day, right? And you go and try and do science on everything that's there. You won't get the kind of science that it's not going to say, oh, this tree has been here for 8 days, like it's, or whatever, or a few days, 3 days. It's not going to give you that.
But that's because it's sort of a forward-facing. Well, it's because of what do you call there's a scientific assumption that you have to have, but it's called the doctrine of uniformitarianism. When you do any, study of the philosophy of science, one of the things that anybody that knows what they're doing understands that they are assuming a doctrine of uniformitarianism,
Right.
things that the laws of nature, as we discuss them, as we use them, as we understand them, have to have always been the way they are to be able to do any sort of scientific inquiry, and that they're going to stay the same way. So that assumption is an assumption, but the scriptures teach that, well, there are points at which you can't assume that backwards past, right? So the first 6 days of creation, each day has significant divine intervention. As soon as you believe there's divine intervention, the doctrine of uniformitarianism doesn't apply anymore, and so you can't do science that direction. That's just the limitations of the scientific inquiry. That's not an insult or anything. I mean, that's just
right.
The scientific inquiry has its limitations, which is why it's always, when it's applied in its right context, it's a huge blessing. When you try to reject the limitations, you run into the despair of Ecclesiastes.
There's a metaphysical question of the tool itself.
Right. Yeah. Because science is a forward-facing discipline. It's about repeatable hypotheses with repeatable experiments. And then it's a huge blessing. It does amazing stuff.
All right. So we took another digression. So let's get back to Aristotle and Plato and influence into Christian thinking. I'm guessing we're going through Augustine. Is that kind of how we get that he's answering the questions that Plato is asking through scripture?
Augustine and Boethius are huge. They are the minds that translate for most of the Middle Ages. They're the minds that translated Greek philosophical thought into the use for Christians. And then you've got just this growing love and desire to just to understand everything. So Aristotle is a systematizer. He tries to take everything we know about different topics and organize it, which is really, really helpful and useful because he gives a way forward for knowledge to be understood in relation to knowledge, different facts to be understood together. And so, his scientific inquiries bring people sort of give people a framework to continue scientific inquiry through the Middle Ages. Plato's philosophical reasoning, it teaches people, it's sort of like doing exercise for your mind. It teaches you how to think clearly, ask the right questions, bring the right kind of hunt for truth, and willingness to question assumptions and dig down to what am I assuming. So they have a method of inquiry that is embraced in the Middle Ages that spreads with Christianity. So because the Christians, they go out establishing libraries everywhere they go, through the monastic system, through the educational, through the school systems that they establish. They bring libraries, and whatever book they can find, they bring with them. They copy out, the Greek plays. They copy out Homer. They sometimes in translation in Latin, because Greek in the West isn't well known, but they copy out it in the Greek as well, where they have it, and they spread knowledge because they aren't really afraid of learning. They're not afraid of understanding. They're not afraid of disagreeing with Plato, but they also understand the brilliance of Plato as they bring him. And then Aristotle, in a lot of ways, he spreads through Africa. He spreads through the Middle East, and then when Muhammad establishes Islam, a lot of those areas are the places where Aristotle was well known. And so Aristotle also then comes into the Middle Ages in the 1000 or so. He starts showing up through Islamic scholars, and there's a lot of conversation between the scholars of Islam and the scholars of Christianity, the scholars of North Africa and the scholars of Europe, especially through Spain. And so Aristotle is a lot of Aristotle's works end up reintroduced after they've been kind of disappeared in 1000 to 1100. And so Thomas Aquinas is tasked, and it's undermining some of the Platonism that has become assumed, and in some ways has become too intertwined with Christianity, Platonic thought forms. So Thomas Aquinas is tasked by the Pope, understand Aristotle. We'll get you as many of the works of Aristotle as we can, and as many of the commentators from the Islamic commentators that we can. We want you to understand Aristotle and give a Christian response. And the Summa Theologica is Aristotle responding to the objections to Christianity that Muslims are bringing through Aristotle.
It was Aquinas, you mean?
Aquinas. Yeah. Aquinas is Summa Theologica. So Aristotle, in a lot of ways, is reintroduced in force through Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas does an amazing job of answering the objections that the Muslims are bringing, to Trinitarianism, to the incarnation, different things,
so how
by means of the thought forms of Aristotle, and reintroducing Aristotle's thought forms to the West.
Okay.
And then the Reformation, in some ways, is a final answer to the objections of Aristotle through the Muslims by synthesizing some of the parts of Plato, some of the parts of Aristotle, using covenant theology as a new basis.
So then how is it that Aristotle and Plato become enemies in this? Because it seems that if Aristotle studied underneath Plato, either he's getting misrepresented or there's some sort of separation between the two, that by the time you get to Thomas Aquinas, you got basically Christians who are kind of Platonic, and you have Muslims that are Aristotelian, and then you have this conflict between the two. What happened that you got this kind of separation here?
So Aristotle, in a number of his writings, or writings that were recorded by his students about what he said, is correcting Aristotle, or is correcting Plato, especially on his ideas of the forms, because Plato.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay,
yeah,
I'm getting it. So let me just tell me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm jumping ahead. Islam is force, right?
Right.
That if that's what's happening with Aristotle, that he's getting looked at, that he can actually force something into its nature. You can force something to its nature versus it has to be what it was established to be from God. Then you can start seeing where like Islam can easily be attracted to Aristotelian thought, because we're going to bring force onto reality to conform it to what we want. Am I going in the right direction?
Yeah.
Okay,
so Aristotle says there isn't some form up there in the heavens. A thing, by virtue of its shape, is partaking in what it is. Right. So you've moved away from.
Women are weak. We'll rule them.
Yeah. Right. We can. So Islam means submission, right? It's a religion of where God is not triune, and so love is not a fundamental characteristic. So where God is all powerful for Christians, but he's also all loving. And so he doesn't give up his authority ever, but he wields it for the good of his creation. You don't have that same expectation in Islam, and Aristotle can be read in a particular way to say that is metaphysically acceptable. Now, Aquinas comes along and shows that even in Aristotle, even taking Aristotle's assumptions, that isn't the only or the proper reading of Aristotle, but it's an understandable application of Aristotle without Trinitarian correctives
and attributes of God. So part of what's being read into this is, man, you got to have John Calvin. Like you got to have Calvin in here, because the attributes of God applies to how you're understanding these guys' philosophy even, right? So if you have, as soon as you said that, all I could think about is all the attributes of God and then how they live together as one function and flow. Everything he does is good,
right.
loving, kind, and merciful, right? Everything, right? Like
and just.
exactly.
And just, yeah, you don't have.
Right. So it's not just power. Sure, there's there, but it's power used for all good, all just, all kind, all mercy. Like, even I was thinking about this the other day. Even God's wrath towards us is merciful, right? Like there's, like, because if he stopped in any way being any of the, we cease to exist in any manner. Like it's just impossible, so there's a certain kind of like, wow, everything God does is amazing. Anyway, I was just thinking about that. So then the attributes of God really does apply in this, because now you're asking, I'm going to say this wrong, but you're asking a fundamental question about how God rules as you're thinking about this philosophical understanding of nature.
Right. And Aquinas does an incredible job of honestly interacting with the Muslim scholars and showing that even Aristotle can't get you that vision of God.
Right. Man, we're touching everybody in this little simple conversation. Okay.
What's fascinating reading Aquinas is just what he is, what honest Christian academic inquiry should it looks like, where he's a careful reader of everyone, whether he agrees or disagrees. He's a careful reasoner, and he does it all with a deep, abiding love of God. Right? You never escape that, right? So that you never start to feel like, oh, he's willing to make compromises here or there or anywhere, because he loves God so much. But it's why he's such a careful interlocutor with people that he disagrees with. He's great.
Don't at me on this, but I don't own any books by Thomas Aquinas. So what do I need to put in my library that I need to read from Aquinas? And is this question going to get me in trouble with anybody? I don't know, maybe.
Aquinas didn't really write short anything. Like,
well, I didn't ask for short anything. That's insulting,
and
Jason.
He's very dry to read. So, but Dante is a huge, he is imbibing Aquinas and then turning it into poetry. So that's, I think if reading Dante, you're actually getting the best of Aquinas in a readable form, much more readable than Aquinas. But Aquinas on the Ten Commandments, I think it's, I know, me too.
Aquinas on the Ten Commandments?
On the Ten Commandments, I think it's called the Commandments of Love. It's good, is really good. I mean, and then the Summa Theologica, any sort of good summary, or taking the best parts of the Summa is worth reading. But it's not. I would say reading Thomas Aquinas isn't fun. Just like reading Aristotle isn't fun. They're not great writers as writers. But they are careful thinkers, and you really need both. And rarely does one person get both. Usually you get, so G.K. Chesterton's he wrote a little biography and summary of Aquinas that's really good, called The Dumb Ox, because that was his nickname, because he was a really big, tall, lumbering man, and he was very, very humble and slow to speak, and so he would call him, he got the nickname The Dumb Ox. This is a great story, one of my favorite Thomas Aquinas stories. He was a very powerful preacher. When he would travel, he would preach, people would be brought to tears and be moved, and he was a very powerful preacher. But he was out in the yard, and I can't remember if it was a bishop or an archbishop, somebody that thought themselves very important, shows up, and he sees this big lumbering monk, and he says, "I need you to carry my bags." And he says, "Yes, sir." And he picks up his bags and he carries them, and they walk through the town, and he get where he needs to go, and he puts the bags down where he went to go see the abbot of the monastery, and he says, "I'm here to see this new famous scholar you've got, Thomas Aquinas. Where is he? I need to talk to him." And the abbot looks back and forth, and he says, "He's the one that's been carrying your bags." And he goes, "What is he? What is he doing?" He's like, "You asked me to carry your bags, and so I carried your bags." He's just a very humble man, but he was a famous scholar throughout the world, and just didn't even flinch at carrying this man's bags across the town. It's just, I love that story.
It's funny when I've heard back and forth about Aquinas. A lot of people don't like Aquinas, and I don't know why. What is it that about Aquinas that really? Because you haven't said anything bad about him since we've been bringing up his name, but there's a lot of. So is this where Thomism comes in and stuff like that?
Yeah. So Thomism as an ism, it is it gives the vocabulary of the way that Roman Catholics currently describe the Mass. So I think a lot of people, when they are objecting to Thomism, they're actually what they think in their mind. What they're objecting to is the way that the current Roman Catholic Church, or for the since the last few hundred years, the Roman Catholic Church has described the Mass. They've used Thomas's vocabulary.
Mm.
And so when they say I'm objecting to Thomism, and then I think there is if you're a Platonist, or a covenantal, the kind of the Platonic covenantalist side of covenant theology, then Thomas Aquinas is your big and philosophical adversary, right? Those are opposites.
I'm a theonomist, so I'm spitting on his grave then, basically. I'm guessing so.
Well, at least probably in his theology of the sacraments, or his theology of the Lord's Supper, you probably wouldn't object too much to his theology of baptism. Whereas it's like that, which is I would say he is the opposite side from the mere memorialists. Right. So you've got the mere memorialist would be one end of the spectrum on the sacraments, and then Aquinas would be the very opposite end from the mere memorialists, on the metaphysical description of of the Lord's Supper, right? Where a mere memorialist would say everything important that is going on is what we're reminded of in our head by the ritual of the Lord's Supper, or they might not even call it a ritual, the symbol of the Lord's Supper, right? So that would be the very opposite end. Americans tend to be mere memorialists by default, assumption, by default. Yeah. So unless there's some reason that you have quit being one, we were all one at some point.
Like a dispensationalist. We were all dispensationalists at one point.
Yeah, whether we knew about it or not, right?
Right.
And then the very opposite end of the spectrum of people that love Jesus but are describing the sacraments would be Thomas Aquinas's metaphysical inquiries on the Lord's Supper. So he's the one that said, well, the accidents of the bread don't change, but the substance does. And so it can truly be the body and blood of Christ, but because the substance has changed, but the accidents remain the same. So it still looks and smells and tastes like wine, but God has changed out the substance, the metaphysical substance of the wine to be the blood of Christ. So he's the one. So that's what I think most people are objecting to. And I think the Aristotelian move away from that. So this was not Thomas, but the later Thomists moved away from a realism in the sense that things have a real nature still, because the nature isn't separate from the thing. And the nature is embedded in the thing. It wasn't long before Thomists were saying, well, no, they weren't really Thomists in the sense that Thomas Aquinas wouldn't have agreed with them, but they started to say, well, what we call it gives it its nature, because the nature is embedded in the thing and we give it its nature by means of what we call it. Where the shift from the mind of God to the mind of man happened in the Thomistic stream, but Thomas wouldn't buy into that. I mean, that wouldn't be, that's one of the ways that that later people, I think, moved away from Thomas in the tradition of
kind of how some Calvinists have moved away from Calvin in some of this.
Yeah. So if somebody comes along and they say, well, I'm a Calvinist, and you say, well, all 4 books of the Institutes, like, do I get book 4 also? Are you a high church Calvinist? Are you a high sacrament Calvinist? Or are you a 5-pointer? Which is all, I mean, Calvin would have agreed with the 5 points. It's not that didn't agree with those.
He would have been like, 5 what? Who made points?
Yeah. He was like,
made points. I didn't know about it. I like him. Sounds good, but I didn't make so help me understand because part of, I'm seeing a political philosophy being argued right now as we see the breakdown of American culture, like you were talking about, and Aristotle seems to be at the forefront of it. How is he a part of helping to shape political philosophy? I guess in the same point, it's funny as I think about this, some of the answer is there. The reason those questions even have to be asked is because the way that we think about philosophy or theology is all separate, and it doesn't have use this word right, telos to it, right? Our theology usually doesn't, right? It right. At least not that applies to social sciences, right? So but those guys didn't have any different understanding of that, right? That was all applied all together, all operating together, where now we have a separation of our philosophy. Theology is different, and it doesn't have necessarily an application directly to political science.
Yeah. Well, I think that's because post maybe 1960, none of metaphysics isn't something that we do anymore. And metaphysics is what holds the other wings of philosophy together. So so when you've got somebody like Aristotle, he wrote the Nicomachean Ethics about how to be a good person, and the Political Ethics about how to be a good citizen, or how to have a good citizenry. What is a good what is a good civilization? A civilizational ethic. But that wasn't separate from his metaphysic, and so he argues on metaphysical grounds. What kind of creature is a human? What do they want? And then how does somebody become good at being a human based on that? Philosophy post Heidegger doesn't do metaphysics anymore. So in the present case, even somebody that's trying to argue for Aristotelian application is not usually arguing for Aristotelian metaphysics or the Platonic Aristotelian conversation around metaphysics being applied. So you can if you don't take into account that understanding of reality as a fully integrated whole, and us trying to fit into it well, if you take that conversation out and then try to read Aristotelian politics into the present, using our sort of
post-enlightenment
Darwinistic metaphysic, I think that Darwinism, gives us is the assumed metaphysic. Then I think you're even going to have even Aristotle is going to be not well applied. I mean, it would be amazing if there was a huge revival of Aristotelian discussions around politics, because I think we'd be so much better off, even if it's not the ideal. You're actually better off than a Darwinistic understanding of society as something that is formed by the pressure applied to it, people as formed by the pressure applied to it, culture as an abstraction, or culture instead of culture as an abstraction, culture as something that's formed by the pressure applied to it or formed mechanistically. But we all use
our Aristotle, unfortunately, is being shaped by our post-enlightenment mindset. So it's hard for us to even read Aristotle right in one sense. But even so, if everybody was talking Aristotelian ideas, wouldn't we still have a problem? Because
so think of the phrase "know thyself," right? That's the phrase that kicks off the philosophical inquiry of virtue for Plato, for Socrates, for Plato, and for Aristotle. Mm-hmm. Know thyself is described as when somebody knows themselves, they know who they are and where they fit into society, and they embrace it with gratitude. That's what it means to know yourself, is to know your place. Now, know your place is what the bad guy says, right? Hey, you need to know your place.
Don't anybody tell you what to do. You need to know yourself.
Don't let anybody tell you what to do. Like that, but we actually should know our place in society, right? That's what we have all bought into democracy as a way of life mentality that is based in Darwin, based in survival of the fittest, evolutionary Darwinism, social Darwinism, and we just don't realize it, right? So, I mean, this is why the Romantic poets, Shelley and Lord Byron, they read Milton, and they thought that Milton was trying to say Satan was the hero because he refused to accept his place. He was willing to overthrow reality rather than accept a place assigned to him, a place that he didn't create for himself. Right. That was a real reading that Shelley and Byron gave of Milton. They said, well, he's the hero. Whereas Milton said, this is a man that won't know, it is the ultimate example of a personage, he's not a human, but he's still a person who refuses to know himself. Right. And all of the lies that are trying to get us to refuse to know ourselves and accept our place and be joyful and grateful, he puts into the mind and mouth of Satan as warnings to us. Because you think, oh yeah, I've had that thought. That's satanic. I should turn away from that thought and go back to embracing, who I'm intended to be, embracing, accepting joyfully my limitations, those sorts of things.
So then what, this is a simple question. We got to go, but this simple question that probably going to take a whole nother show to work through, and that's fine. We can do that. But when you were at the point of your culture where piety is something that has been forgotten, even the concept, the definitions of it, how it applies, what it's supposed to do, who it's to, covenant has been completely destroyed. Not completely. There's fragments of it. I think it's been amazing to see what's happening with Trump and the current American, the new assembly of its members, and the sides changing. But when you have this kind of catastrophe that we are right now in America, what kind of poetry do we need to be giving to society? Because I think you can, part of what's happening inside of, I think, American culture, particularly Reform culture, which is why I'm grateful for it, is that it's restoring its academic fervor to be a voice inside of public society again.
Right.
So this is what I love about all the fighting that I'm seeing inside of the CREC stuff, the PCA stuff. I don't think that they see it this way, but these conversations about Aristotle, these conversations about Plato, these conversations about classic philosophical political thought is, to me, the birthing of these dead bones beginning to live again, sinew and stuff coming back on these bones of a political philosophical thought of Christians coming back to its seat on public in the public square that we've never seen really before, right? Like we have, this is really amazing to see this, and it's having a real influence, and it's starting to matter. And so I'm appreciating this, but I don't want to be, though there are guys who are gifted to have those conversations, I'm finding that as they're having those conversations, somebody has to popularize and communicate the beauty of what they're saying in the art. Once they figure out where they're landing at, whatever it is, but somebody's got to be Dante. Somebody's got to be Dante.
Right.
And no one, I don't see that happening quite yet. I see the arguments taking place. What is the poetry that you start, or the beauty that you start portraying inside of a broken society like this? Is it Dante? Is it, that kind of poetry? No one even knows how to read poetry anymore. So then poetry doesn't really work the same way, because it's not, in a postmodern world, what's the tools that you use that are not that are polemic with the kind of polemics that get beyond watchful dragon storytelling? But even storytelling, it's got TikTok now. So you got like everything is kind of, it's this weird place to live where you got to figure out how to communicate within these tools, but not in the same way now. Does that make sense? It's a really weird question, but
I mean, I think practically speaking, whatever tool you've got is the one you use, right? So, if you rap, learn this stuff and rap. If you are comic book, if you do comics, learn this stuff, do comics.
Moses, what's in your hand? This is one of those moments,
right? Yeah. I do think that's the case. I also think that hymn writers or church music is probably one of the most important things that is overlooked in these conversations, because our kids, they learn a lot of their theology from the hymns and the psalms that they sing. And so I think that's one thing that probably would be really important artistically to dig in on. I mean, think about the Christmas hymns that the rest of the world is going to be singing all month, right? Because they're great hymns, right? Joy to the World literally plays in the mall because it is one of the greatest hymns and songs ever written. And so it sneaks past Watchful Dragons all the time.
Well, just the concept of Christmas does too.
The whole concept of Christmas does. So, I mean, I think the restoration of the worshipful arts is something, liturgy, prayer writing, preaching, hymns, those arts, the worship centered arts, I think are a really important piece, because that forms the people that write the movies. You look at something like comic books, that as an art form took 100 years to become the central art form. So in some ways,
it's all in movies and
everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. It owns movies. Yeah,
it owned. Yeah, and the first 4 cycles of the Marvel universe, those weren't the first Marvel movies. They had made. Right. I mean, Howard the Duck was the first one, and then they made all sorts of other ones to learn how to do that. But those were, in some ways, that was the peak and the end of a century of comic books, and it wore it blew all of its steam, and now it's in a rebuild phase. And that's
what idiot decided to use Howard the Duck? Why? What idiot? Out of all the things to start with.
I think it's brilliant to start there because it has a small but rabidly faithful audience. So they knew the size of their audience, but it was one of the most passionate audiences. And so they could make an inexpensive movie and know that they're going to make enough movie to make their next movie with it, which they did. They were right. It was a really smart move. They went for the most passionate audience.
Yeah, that's good marketing. That's definitely
really good marketing.
It's brilliant marketing. But
I know
it wasn't Howard the Duck.
It was not a great movie. It was not a great. It was, but
I'll have one image of Howard the Duck, and I just remember him crawling in the back of somewhere, his feet up somewhere, crawling in the back of. That's the only image I have, and I just remember it was a bad movie as a kid. Somehow I wasn't supposed to watch it.
But it had a rabidly passionate audience. It was a really smart move when they said, where do we start? We don't really know how to make movies yet. Where do we start? Well, start with the audience that will forgive everything because they got a movie of their favorite character, right? It was really smart.
Yeah. It's debatable.
Well, it was financially smart. I mean, right? If they said, we're going to learn how to make a movie, we're going to do it with Howard the Duck, and it's going to be we've got this passionate audience, they'll show up. They did. And then we'll be better and able to do our next movie.
I think it was in Guardians of the Galaxy or one of the films that came out recently that showed like a flash of Howard the Duck. And I remember the internet blew up because they want that back so bad. They want to call a mulligan on that one so bad. And so there is still that passionate audience out there. But I think they even knew it was a mix because they haven't done anything else close to touching that until just now. Right. Since Howard the Duck until now, they knew that was a mistake because they haven't done so, we need to restore this to get those fans back what they wanted. No, they said let's not touch that with a 10-foot pole.
But think of, all of the bad Sony comic book movies, how grateful that audience was when Wolverine, the new
Logan?
No, the newest one with Ryan Reynolds, Deadpool and Wolverine, honored all of the fans that stuck it out through movies that weren't great, but they were still faithful fans.
Mm-hmm.
That's
an IOU. That's
It was, but that's what it looks like to honor and care about your fans. I mean, it was, I think, you know, when, when you show that as much as the critics, dogged on those movies and all that, people still enjoy them and were grateful. And, like I watched those as a kid, and, when he says flame on, and I don't know about your theater, but my theater exploded when he said flame on.
Four.
Yeah. Because it was
in Deadpool, because or in
Deadpool and Wolverine. Yeah.
Okay. I just remember Flame On and Fantastic Four, and
that's what it's from, right? But
right.
You've got when everybody thinks it's Captain America, and then he says Flame On, and it's Fantastic Four. My theater exploded. I saw it the first showing on opening day, and so real fans. I've got a picture of me with the guy that was dressed like Wolverine that sat behind me. Like it was those real. So
I those people to me are one step away from going into the insane asylum. One step away. You got to grow up at some point. That's just it's not okay.
Totally. I totally agree. Okay. And I still got my picture with him.
It's not okay. It's just not okay. You no.
I would never be that guy. I don't.
I just, come on, man. We better stop there before we ruin your great ability to communicate this stuff. What? So, okay. So, I went and got, was it Necromancian Ethics?
Oh, the Nicomachean Ethics. Yeah.
So I got that. What else do I need to get? Metaphysics by Aristotle?
No, I would get, well, you have the, so I read.
You said Dante.
Out, the Britannica Great Books, Plato.
Oh yeah, I got the Great Book set.
Yeah, that's where I read my Plato, because it's got a really good translation.
I got a Great Book set, but I have my 5-foot bookshelf.
Oh yeah.
So I can.
It's probably been in there. Yeah, it's probably got Benjamin Jowett in there, and then I use that Britannica Great Books of Aristotle and Aquinas is where I read Aquinas as well.
I can probably find all that stuff in my 5-foot bookshelf, right? That's, all right, that's good.